Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to today's Atlas Leadership Academy webinar. I'm your host, Sarah Bennett. Joining us today is Luis H. Ball, a current Atlas Network board member, as well as the owner, founder, and publisher of the PanAm Post, an online bilingual publication dedicated to news and opinion about the Americas. When many of us hear of Venezuela, our minds automatically think of the current issues there, like corruption, inflation, and political unrest. While many of us watch the turmoil from a distance, Luis has a special viewpoint. Born in the capital, Caracas, Luis is a native Venezuelan with a unique perspective on the situation. Luis will present for about 25 minutes, after which we will have some time for Q&A. Feel free to send us your questions as they come up during his presentation through the chat box you see on your screen. I'll turn the time over to Luis to talk about what's happening in Venezuela, what caused the crisis, and what Atlas Network partners can learn from it.
Well, thank you. Glad to be here this morning. I'm going to talk about not only the current situation in Venezuela, but I think it's more importantly to talk about Venezuela in terms of something that is very popular nowadays to discuss, which is the so-called democratic socialism. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of a background. It's going to be a little hurried, given the material covered. I normally give this talk in about an hour, so I'll try to be as brief as possible. Most people wonder how is it that the country with the world's largest oil reserves, and that was the world's largest oil producer until 1971, larger than Saudi Arabia, finds itself in this position, in a failed state position run by a clique of corrupt mafia bosses using socialism as a tool to control the masses. Well, the story, which is I tried to tell here, is you'll see in your screens a picture of Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela that at one point had 4,000 oil wells. So how do we get here? Venezuela was an extremely prosperous country for 50 years. It had the world's fastest growing economy during the 1950s. I mean, it was the China of the world, put it that way, in those terms. The economy was growing at 9–10% a year for a decade. In 1965, Venezuela's oil exports represented almost 2/3 of world trade in oil. That's an unbelievable market share, and it has never been matched again by any other nation. Amongst Latin American countries, we were by far the most prosperous. Venezuela's per capita income in the early 1980s was higher than all of the other Andean countries, including Chile, combined. And as you can see here, Venezuelan exports in 1960 were higher than Brazil, a country with 10 times the population of Venezuela. Again, the growth rate from 1920 to 1980, Venezuela had the world's highest average annual growth rate. It was unmatched, even by Asian tigers and the recovery of Europe, the miracle of Italy and Germany, and so forth. During those 60 years, a lot was done by various governments. Infrastructure was amongst the top, the best in the world. We had at one point, one of the largest hydroelectric dams in the world. We had some of the, most largest bridges in the world. Educational infrastructure was magnificent. Highways, we had, let's say, American levels highways, even more modern than some American highways at the time in the 50s and 60s. Again, the country was well managed for many years. Here's a quote, an actual quote from the Chase Manhattan Bank in 1965, which said, "Caracas has excellent communication services, state-of-the-art airport, has the lowest taxes in the region, and incredibly, for today's audience, it was by far the safest city for executives and their family." This is Caracas, Venezuela, 1965. So in 1970, Venezuela remained the world's largest oil exporter. 67% of the population was considered middle class by European and American standards. We had the world's lowest inflation rate for over a decade, and actually, if you look at the period, 100-year period, 1870 to 1970, Venezuela had the lowest inflation rate in the world for 100 years. We had 5% average growth for 15 years. We had a higher per capita income than Italy and Japan, and we had 100 years of currency stability. Venezuela was, I think, together with the Swiss franc, the only country in the world that did not devalue against the gold in 1934 when the U.S. changed the gold standard. What happened was, beginning in 1972, 1973, Venezuela had a lot of bad luck politically. Imagine in 1973, with the Arab oil embargo, Venezuela's government income, because of the increase in the price of oils, quadrupled in 1 year. And at the same time, that same year, in 1973, it was the first time that one of the political parties in Venezuela achieved not only the presidency, but also majority control of the Venezuelan Congress. That had never happened before. We had the split Congress through our democratic history. So we had a one-party controlling Congress and controlling the presidency. Now imagine if, let's say, in the United States, you had a Bernie Sanders presidency, and all of a sudden you had the U.S. government revenue quadruple that year, not only eliminating any deficit, but giving the government almost unlimited amount of funds without the deficit. That's what happened in 1973. So the so-called democratic socialists that we had in power proceeded to implement their policies, and for the first time they had free reign because they had control of both houses of Congress. So oil, steel, mining, and aluminum industries were nationalized. Coffee and cocoa trading was nationalized. This was important. Venezuela was at that time was the world's third largest coffee producer and the fifth largest cocoa producer. The central bank, which was 50% privately owned and operated as the original Bank of England and the Bank of Japan or the Bank of France originally, where the government, it wasn't a government-owned institution, it was completely independent central bank, was nationalized. Foreign investment was curtailed in many, many industries, and price controls were established for everything. We had price controls for movie theaters, we had price controls for French champagne. And this happened in a country that year had the second lowest inflation rate in the world. The president at the time was Carlos Andrés Pérez. He actually, this is an actual quote from him: "We are now free to develop the nation with a new kind of businessman, not tied to the old private sector." So, this new additional government revenue, the government actually tried to create a new type of businessman with government loans to, let's say, friendly businessmen to what they considered the revolutionary policies. By 1998, 14 years after these policies started, and it was kept in place by different governments of different parties, 100% of goods were subject to import license. Foreign exchange permits for travel and imports had been established in a country that was originally awash in the foreign exchange. Government controlled the entire economy, but private property was allowed to exist. The model was a bit of that famous Leninist phrase of controlling the commanding heights of the economy, letting the private sector keep operating some private property. The result of these policies, the private investment collapsed, inflation surged, negative real wage growth appeared for the first time in Venezuela. The size of government quadrupled in very short period of time, and corruption appeared. Public management deteriorated. Because of corruption, political parties became discredited, and poverty rose significantly. Incredibly, as government revenue rose, so did poverty. At the same time, socialism was applied to the oil business. This man on the picture is Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso, the founder of OPEC, Venezuelan oil minister in the 60s. He is considered the founder of OPEC. He considered the oil income a corrupting influence on the Venezuelan society. He called it the devil's excrement with those words. And he pushed for Venezuela to save its oil for future generations. That is, Venezuela would purposely limit its own productions and purposely give up market share to other countries. Oil production collapsed. In 1965, it was 3.5 million. In 2006, it was 2 million. But oil production before Hugo Chavez in the early 1980s actually reached only 1 million barrels. I mean, about the same, a little over what producing today in the 1980s, because these policies and these ideas of Pérez Alfonso were faithfully applied. Income per capita, as you can see, peaked in 1974, and then it rapidly, you can see the collapse. As oil income rose, the per capita income was dropping because the private economy was falling. So by the 1990s, political parties were discredited. There was endless economic decline. We had an economic decline that lasted 20 years. Corruption was rampant, and of course, due to lack of investment in security, in police, crime became a huge issue. In 1998, when Hugo Chavez won the only time he won fairly an election, the first time, the Caracas police had the same number of personnel that he had in 1969. That's 30 years earlier. While the population had multiplied by 5. So, of course, crime would skyrocket. Who was Hugo Chavez? Hugo Chavez was a known quantity. Very few people have published about this. Hugo Chavez was recruited by the person on the extreme left on the white and black and white picture. Oh, no, I'm sorry. On the bottom right in the black and white picture is Alfredo Maneiro. Alfredo Maneiro was the founder of a Maoist party called, which was illegal, declared illegal, called Causa Radical. And he was very close to Fidel Castro, and he was actually trained in Cuba and so forth. Alfredo Maneiro recruited Hugo Chavez as a mole in the Venezuelan army when he was a second lieutenant who just came out of the military academy. So, I mean, we could talk a lot about that. If somebody wants to know more about this, I can explain. But Hugo Chavez was basically, before trying his coup attempt in 1992 against the elected government, Hugo Chavez had been a Cuban mole in the Venezuelan army for over 20 years. So Hugo Chavez gets elected, and the revolution begins. But the revolution, Chavez was careful. He did not take power through an armed revolution like Fidel Castro. Venezuela had almost 50 years of democracy. He had very established institutions. He had a working constitution. So he had to tread carefully, and he did not completely control the army initially, even though the army had been infiltrated significantly through other Cuban agents, not only Hugo Chavez. And these people all got to power with Hugo Chavez. So he applied the revolutionary process in stages. The first stage was total control of state powers. He managed to change the constitution to get himself reelected endlessly, and to take control of the judiciary through the change of the constitution. The second stage was consolidate his international position. He used the with incredible luck, the price of oil went from $8 a barrel when Chavez first took office to $140 a barrel in less than 10 years. So with all this oil windfall, he started to what we called in Venezuela petro diplomacy. He started to buy out and purchase political support from leftist parties with that money. Extreme leftist parties were financed from Venezuela throughout Latin America and Spain and even other countries. And we can talk about that. I could talk extensively about that. We don't have time. And then the stage 3, once the first 2 were implemented, then he got to the economic system. Initially, Chavez did not attack the private sector and had very, very few nationalizations or confiscations. We all knew, those who knew what his intentions were and who knew him and his background, we knew that was coming. But many people were fooled by the fact that initially he seemed to be very conservative in terms of the economic plan he was going to implement. And that should be cautionary. That's caution I would tell the Mexicans, because Andrés López Obrador is literally a carbon copy of Hugo Chavez, and one of the things he's following is he's being careful about the economy from initially. So during the Chavez governments, eventually when he did get to the economy, currency controls were established, foreign exchange transactions were criminalized, price controls returned, gasoline really literally became free. You can get free gas in Venezuela. You tip the attendant in a gas station, but gasoline is essentially free. State capitalism made a return, hundreds of nationalizations and confiscations without payment of private property and industries. Rural land expropriation was huge, over 3 million hectares. I mean, that's 13 million acres or something were expropriated. Active army officers were named judges, which was completely unconstitutional. And union leaders were persecuted and were imprisoned or were forced into exile, and unions were completely put under state control. By 2007, Chavez had achieved his first 2 stages that I mentioned, and thus he openly described himself as a communist for the first time, and he openly declared himself a Marxist socialist. Before 2007, he always said he was a humanist, and he rejected being a Marxist. During those years, first 10 years, 15 years, the opposition was not only feckless, but in my opinion, was corrupt. They tried to fight Chavismo with Chavismo light, saying, "Oh no, Chavez is authoritarian. We are democratic socialists." And of course, they tried to be, more popular socialists than Chavez. That was the idea of an opposition that we had for a few years. This idea was mainly led by the guy on the right, Henrique Capriles. The Chavez geopolitical strategy worked, and he aligned himself through purchase of, through using money, incredibly, with Russia and China. By giving Russia and China, it wasn't ideological. Russia is not close ideologically to Hugo Chavez by any stretch of the imagination. But if the Chavez wanted to buy $17 billion in weapons from Russia, Russia became very interested in Hugo Chavez. So initially, and actually all the way to the end, many businessmen supported the regime. They were enriching themselves by plugging themselves into this petrodollar boom that Chavez had when the price of oil multiplied by 20 under his watch. Some even boasted that Chavez was good for business. They gave, interviews to foreign publications saying that Chavez was good for business. And of course, the Europeans, members of the European Union were extremely happy by Chavez's confrontation with the U.S., getting contracts for all kinds of issues, replacing the traditional presence of American companies in certain markets with their own presence, because they were, let's say, more aligned with Hugo Chavez. 2019 finds Venezuela in extreme poverty. You've seen the headlines, the horrors that are going on in Venezuela in terms of poverty, crime, and so forth. How the Maduro regime, these are actually two deputies to the National Assembly who have just been punched by Chavista thugs, paramilitary thugs. The country has continually reacted. There have been demonstrations throughout the years, and I would argue that these have been the largest public demonstrations on the planet, never seen on the planet. These are literally millions and millions of people on the street. Unfortunately, our opposition leaders have not been, well, the government made it very hard for images, the correct images, to get out of the country. People who had cameras on top of buildings were arrested. Drones were forbidden to fly over public demonstrations. People were arrested even for having a drone close to a demonstration, even if the drone was not flying. So partly was due to incompetence from our leaders, and partly due to, yes, persecution. The images have not leaked out as to the incredible, amazing extent of demonstrations in Venezuela against the regime. And then we had episodes of the entire country on arms, as in 2014 and 2017. So the current situation, I think, is well known. We have the world's highest inflation rate. That is the highest recorded in modern history, at least in 70 or 80 years. The economy has shrunk over 60% since 1999. Per capita consumption now is lower than any other nation in the Americas. Yesterday, the Wall Street Journal wrote an article saying, giving some incredible statistics, how, for example, consumption of milk has dropped by 80%, consumption of chicken by 75%. It just gives you an idea of the catastrophe facing the Venezuelan situation. The government is a narco-communist dictatorship. It applies communist dogma at the same time that is probably the world's, as former President Pastrana of Colombia said today, Maduro is the modern Pablo Escobar. The regime follows Cuban policies for economic policy and depends completely on Cuba for state security. At this point, I can just mention very briefly that the Venezuelan army would probably be ready to turn against Maduro, except that officers in the army are closely watched by Cuban operatives. Their families are threatened. Top officials are being forced to move from their own houses or apartments into military installations with their entire family. So, their families would be under danger if they ever try to turn on Maduro. The corruption in Venezuela is really, I think, something never seen on this scale in world history. This man on the picture is Tarek El Aissami. He was vice president under Maduro until recently, and he's currently the foreign minister. His personal accounts in the United States were frozen with $400 million in them. Funds already frozen from cabinet members amount to over $2 billion in their personal accounts. Cash seized from Maduro family members, these are actual cash in dollar bills, amounts to over almost $1 billion already. The most effective leaders of the opposition were imprisoned. Mr. Ledesma on the right escaped from prison and is now in exile. Leopoldo Lopez on the left was released from prison after being tortured for years. and is now under house arrest. The nation has tried to defy it, but the Venezuelans have no weapons. Chavez, one of the measures he took was a measure to disarm the population back in 2008. Anyone with a gun anywhere, including his own property, faced possible arrest. So, with rocks and just masses of people on the streets, you cannot defeat a modern totalitarian state. That's just impossible to do. Now, the current situation, we have a brave new leader, and all of you have continually read the headlines which call him a self-proclaimed president. That's completely wrong. That's, someone, as it happens today in the press, someone used that phrase and online, and then all the other journalists who are very lazy copied the phrase. The Venezuelan Constitution establishes that if the president is absent, if there is no president, the president of the National Assembly is obligated, is mandated, whether he wants it or not, to become interim president. What happens is that Maduro's term expired on January 10th. Maduro knew that his term was going to expire and he had no chance of winning an election. So he first put all his rivals in prison. Then he made all the main political parties in the country illegal. And then he ran for president almost unopposed. His opposition, so-called quote-unquote opposition, is a former minister of Hugo Chavez, who now claims to be in opposition. So he won those quote-unquote elections that at the time were officially not recognized, and he was told that he was not recognized by the European Union, the United States, Canada, and many other countries, all Latin American countries. So when January 10th came around, he was not legally the president. That's why immediately on January 10th, the United States recognized our new leader, Juan Guaido, as president of Venezuela, because he was president of the National Assembly. He is a very brave man. He has shown it this week, if you know the events of this week. But not only has shown it this week, this is on the right, you have a picture of him just about 3 or 4 years ago, coming out of a demonstration against the government where he was shot by Venezuelan police. Continued, we have been lucky in that Barack Obama is no longer the president of the United States. The Obama policy, spearheaded by the State Department and an official at the State Department called Tom Shannon, their idea of working for democracy was to endlessly engage with Maduro in conversation. And to, let's say, through their, giving away concessions to Cuba, they would think that then Maduro would be softer in his positions. Fortunately, I think the Trump administration understands who they're dealing with. They know that this is a band of thugs. They know that having conversations with these people or dialogue with these people just help these people gain time and do away with their with the opposition in their local communities. So the strong international action that has been shown over the last few months must continue, and particularly the European Union has to become a stronger player in these actions. I'm missing a slide here. Sorry, I'm missing a slide that I wanted to put here. Sorry. I have to. Well, here I'll show it to you. No, that's not it. Oh, this is the slide. Already 4 million Venezuelans have fled the country. That's about almost 15% of the population. That's a higher percentage of the population than the population that left Cuba initially from 1961. Over 1 million are refugees in Colombia. The Brookings Institution has published a study stating that this year alone, 4 million more could flee. If that happens within the next 9 months, Colombia would face a human tsunami, literally. This would be by far, it would be larger by a large factor than the Syrian situation, and it would be equal or worse to the worst refugee crisis ever seen in Africa in the worst moments. This has never even come close to happening in the Western Hemisphere. This is unique in the Americas, and this would be probably one of the world's worst human catastrophes. That's what we're facing today if Maduro remains in power. So I'm now opening to questions. If you want to learn my outlook for the first few days, I'll talk about that in the question and answer period. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your presentation, Luis. I'm sure it's been very difficult for you to kind of watch this transition going from the lowest inflation in 1970 in Venezuela to the inflation that we're seeing now in these crazy numbers that we're kind of experiencing from outside of the situation. And the first question that we have for you is, how did life change during that transition from prosperity to poverty? And how was life during that change for you and the people around you? And did anybody kind of predict the catastrophe that would happen?
Okay. Venezuelans have a saying that Chavez applied a recipe for cooking a live frog, and this is actually true of Venezuela since 1970. The saying is that if you try to cook a frog and you put him in a hot pan, he will jump and you won't be able to cook him. But if you put water at room temperature and slowly heat the water, he will die. He will be cooked to death. He won't realize he's being cooked. And that's what happened. Everything was gradual. Initially, in the deterioration that we have from 1970 to 1998, it was these democratic socialist policies that bankrupted the country. I mean, these were suicidal policies, like purposely reducing the oil production, limiting foreign investment, and so forth. Well, Hugo Chavez was more radical, but he also did it in a gradual way. And because he was so lucky in that the price of oil multiplied by 20 during his government, he was able to throw money into problems and initially hide the problems. And you had many people in the international press believing that he was doing good. I mean, if you read the New York Times, you think, and you take a New York Times issue of 2008 and read about Hugo Chavez, you think he was Jesus Christ reborn. And these were all Potemkin villages. All these social programs were just literally somebody standing with a bunch of bills in their hand, giving people money. They were not real social programs. They were not, let's say, they were not structured in any way to become permanent. So the change was slow, and so the people were all of a sudden, they just began to feel their deterioration slowly. Of course, the lower classes felt it faster. People in the lower income levels, because when the private sector began to shrink, it was harder to get a job and so forth. In the middle classes, it was slower, and but it was that way. It took years for this to be felt.
That's very interesting to kind of see that change and those things that happen without people really knowing exactly what was going on. The next question for you, Luis, is what can think tanks or other organizations in our movement do to prevent crises like this from happening in their countries?
Well, in Venezuela, I belong to a think tank, CEDICE, that has been part of the Atlas Network for many years, that we have done a lot. I mean, one of the key issues is to fight the battle in the universities. Venezuela, through the 60s and 70s, went through the exact same process we see now in the United States, where universities became literally socialist territories. Socialist ideas were the only ones being taught, and from there, these ideas became popular politically. But the key issues were, the key places were the universities. In CEDICE, back in the early 90s, we started a program of giving actual economic books to universities for their libraries, because we realized universities, when you went to an economics department and say, okay, let's look at your library here, and all the books were written by Russians, and Marx was considered part of the economics curriculum. So we started giving away free libraries, and I went to a university in western Venezuela, in Cabimas, is on the eastern side of Lake Maracaibo, and in Cabimas, the head of the economics department actually almost cried when I appeared there with the books, because said, I haven't been able to teach because all my books are Marxist. This is not economics. And because we managed to do a slow change of mentality in the universities, but that should have been done 30 years before. And the damage done in Venezuela and eventually in the politics of the country by the takeover of universities from the extreme left was very deep. That would be my advice with the think tanks: concentrate on the universities.
That's very interesting to kind of go from universities where ideas are discussed and where they kind of really start to grow with a student base. The next question that we have is there anything that other countries like the United States can do to help Venezuela and to kind of help this revolution, or is it something that just kind of has to run its course on its own?
No, well, the United States is helping a lot. As I said, the help we have already received from the Trump administration is incredible, and is extreme support. I think that one thing is that we have to, particularly amongst the libertarian world, there's a lot of pundits that know nothing of Latin America, know nothing of Venezuela, and are writing articles disencouraging the United States to intervene more. And they equate Venezuela with Iraq, or they equate Venezuela with Afghanistan. These are people who are really clueless as to what's going on in Venezuela. Venezuela is the most pro-American country in the world, I would dare to say. Whatever happened in Central America with the United States in the 30s or whatever has no bearing on the Venezuelan population. Just one example: when Bill Clinton made his big Latin American tour in 1997, the only city where security allowed him to walk the streets was Caracas, and he was mobbed by admirers in Caracas. The Venezuelan army is pretty much doesn't need. There's no need for an invasion. All you would need is pretty much a show of force for the army to be able to get rid of these Cuban operatives that keep the army from rebelling. So all these articles written by, and I repeat, libertarian pundits are not helping. And I think one of the things I would demand as an American reading opinion on this is to people who know nothing of the region should not be opining on this issue, because they're really clouding the issue.
Thank you for sharing that, Luis. It's interesting how people who have good intentions in other countries can sometimes do more harm than they need to do. We only have time for one more question, and that's, what do you think will be next? Do you have a prediction for how things will turn out in the next few years?
Well, Maduro is gone. My opinion is that Maduro will not last a year. The only reason why Maduro remains in power, as I said, is that the problem facing the officers that would want to push him out with their own security and their own families. That's one issue. The other issue is that there are 20,000 Cubans in Venezuela. And the problem that the Cubans would face if the Maduro government falls overnight, probably those 20,000 Cubans would be massacred. I mean, the anger of the Venezuelan population against the Cubans is unbelievable. And there could be an events where Cuban personnel would be literally lynched if the Maduro government falls. So Cuba is facing a huge problem. Cuba does not have the resources for an airlift for 20,000 people. They don't have the planes, they don't have the ships, they don't have the resources. These 20,000 Cubans have been there for years. They rotate regularly. It's not the same people there for 20 years. Every couple of months, 600 come out, 600 come in, and so forth. But there's 20,000 of them there. So one of the issues, and one of the is that as Maduro's personal security, the presidential guard in Venezuela is Cuban. Is that the Cubans won't let Maduro go because they are very much afraid of what's going to happen with their own personnel in Venezuela. So that's another big issue. And I think the United States has been realizing recently that one way out for the current situation in Venezuela is to put the screws on Cuba. The screws have to be put much stronger on Cuba in the next few months for the dominoes to begin to fall. But Maduro is already a man imprisoned in the presidential palace. He cannot go anywhere. He would be literally lynched anywhere in Venezuela. So he's a man protected by the military, what's left of the military protecting him, and by the Cubans. He has no control of the country already, other than the security apparatus. So my guess is that he won't last a year.
Wow, well, that's the last question that we have for you today, Luis. Thank you so much for presenting for us. This concludes today's webinar. Later this month, instead of our regular webinar format, we'll be doing something a little bit different. On March 21st, the Atlas Leadership Academy will be broadcasting a live webinar from Los Angeles during our Lights, Camera, Liberty training. We will be joined by Dugan Bridges, Senior Program Director at Talias and Nexus, and Vale Sloan from Atlas Network, talk about storytelling in a video format, both how important it is and how to design your videos to have an impact. Registration will be available on our website shortly. Thanks again, Luis, for this important presentation, and I hope to see you all at the next webinar.
Thank you.